Perhaps the most obvious way to form a shape is by establishing a border with a line. Drawing an outline around an area to enclose it is often the first step in establishing boundaries, as we have seen. The artist Mondrian used black outlines to divide his space into unequal interlocking shapes. The painter Gauguin sometimes left his outlines showing in his paintings. He did this to flatten out his forms to give an otherworldly or spiritual feeling, as he did with Jesus in this crucifixion scene. Due to the nature of its materials, stained glass naturally requires outlines. Small pieces of glass are shaped and installed in a frame made out of lead. The soft metal both keeps the glass in place and makes a clear border. I made this shape when I moved my garden to a new location. I pulled the old boards out of the soil, and this was the result. But as was true with line, most shapes we encounter in our everyday experiences are not outlined, but are formed more naturally by differences. One difference is contrast, or value differences. In this drawing, the artist has formed geometric zones that differ in value. Some of these zones are descriptive, that is, they tell us something. In this case, they reveal a human head. Other lines are dynamic, that is, they give movement. But when they are filled in with value, they create planes or shapes that set them apart from each other. In this painting by Kazimir Malevich, this idea is pushed almost out of our visual range. The values between the shapes and the surroundings are almost identical. Can you see the shapes? In black and white photography, shapes are formed by value differences. This is hard to see in most photographs, but when the artist chooses a scene of high contrast, as this artist has done, the distinctions between shapes are more obvious. In applications that use color, value change is often accompanied by changes of hue. The various shapes in this example do use values to differentiate between shapes, as we can see when color is removed. But color changes give us more detail about those changes. Here's an example of both value and color change being used in a single image. Yellow and green are added to the pure values to add visual interest and variety. An art form that relies almost entirely on color change is mosaic. Mosaics are made of small units of color called tesserae. These are often of tile, but are also frequently stone or glass. In this ancient art form, images are constructed by cementing these small units of color into a pattern. Upon close inspection, the color units are more obvious, but from a longer viewing distance they blend together, losing their distinct color differences. As we know, lines can simulate textures. In most line drawings, forms are determined by differences in value, such as in the differences between the logs and fence in my woodpile sketch. But also note that there is a difference in simulated texture. The logs feel different than the fence, and the grass feels different than the logs. Patchwork quilting also frequently employs fabrics of various textures. These textures are often actual texture differences rather than implied, as is the case in drawing. It is a known fact that in life we are not usually given complete experiences. Things often require time to mature. Jobs are frequently left undone, or we have to leave a carnival before we've tried all of the rides. When we observe or experience such things, we have a desire to complete them, which is why we see toddlers getting upset when they are not ready to leave a park. Artists and designers often leave unresolved forms in their works also. But in this case, our natural desire to complete our experiences leads us to complete the forms. We call this act of completion closure. In this sketch of my cat Pepper, I have only filled in her black pattern and did nothing about her white sections. Nevertheless, you get a good sense of Pepper. You know that you are looking at a black and white pattern cat. Artists can be more intentional, filling in more of the shape by surrounding it with many or more complete forms, as Salvador Dali is doing with this portrait. In this photograph of a spiral staircase, the photographer focuses on the circle at the bottom. This circle, however, isn't part of the stairs. It is made by the fact that the stairs are surrounding it. Shapes can manifest themselves in a variety of ways. When shapes mimic life forms, we call them biomorphic. This portrait of George Washington is an attempt to capture as much of his likeness as possible. The shapes are curvilinear. They bend and undulate across the surface of the canvas because humans are made up of such lines. Biomorphic shapes can also include non-organic items which have been altered to look organic. Hans Arp here has taken a non-organic thing, a fork, and has distorted it by exaggerating its curvilinearity and applying a non-symmetrical sense to it. The result is an item that could still function as a fork, but that has more lifelike movement. And from this, it should be no surprise to see that biomorphic shapes can be completely non-representational. This mural by artist Juan Moreau is constructed of organic shapes that may allude to fish or birds in some way, but is otherwise totally non-objective. The opposite of biomorphic shapes are rectilinear shapes. These shapes are constructed of straight edges with sharp angles. Kazimir Malevich has used them heavily in his suprematist paintings. Note that even though he is heavily reliant upon geometric shapes, they are still dynamic due to placement, scale, and color change. So even though they are man-made entities, rectilinear shapes do not have to be totally devoid of action. Rectilinear shapes became popular in art and design in the early 20th century. Frank Lloyd Wright was one of the most influential architects and designers of his day and ours. Here is a window that he designed using rectilinear shapes and lines. Translated into 3 dimensions, his architecture too is composed of mainly rectilinear forms. There are, however, shapes that don't seem to have a determined edge at all, though we can still tell that they are shapes. We call these shapes amorphous, which means that they are not clearly defined. In this painting, Martin Johnson Heade treats his clouds as amorphous shapes. We know that the clouds do indeed have an edge, but it isn't exactly clear where one cloud ends and another begins. In the Mona Lisa, Leonardo da Vinci is using a technique called sfumato, which means smoke or fume in Italian, to give a hazy appearance to his background. This helps the figure to stand out and makes the background feel more unified, but it does lend a slightly indeterminate feeling to the landscape. And of course, this can be done in abstract work as well. Here, shapes are determined by color, but some of them bleed and blend together to make their ending harder to figure out. In the history of visual art and design, 3 methods of image making have been identified. These 3 strategies are representationalism, abstraction, and non-representationalism. In representationalism, shapes are meant to replicate or mimic what the eye sees. This goes back to the beginning of mark making. Even the ancient Egyptians had a concern for it. as can be seen here. Art has gone through many cycles of representationalism, including the style known as realism. The painter Thomas Eakins was an American realist whose primary concern was the accurate recording of visual information without embellishment or exaggeration. Abstract shapes are those that begin with or reference real shapes, but alter or exaggerate them in some way. Again, looking at the work of the ancient Egyptians, we can see this in effect. The artists that worked during the reign of Akhenaten often depicted the pharaoh with exaggerated features. Here we see Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti shown with their children in this relief sculpture. Notice the stretched out heads and bodies with exaggerated curves. The difficulty with abstraction is that it is difficult to tell whether a shape is meant to reference a real object or not. Mondrian is a prime example. In his early work, it can seem as though he is working without reference to anything, as in this example. But we can see through his process that he is indeed abstracting forms. He begins by painting a tree. Note that this tree has already been exaggerated in many ways. But he begins to focus on the basic forms that the tree is making, which then ends up looking as if there is no reference. And indeed, Mondrian does make the shift away from looking at real things into non-representationalism. Non-representational shapes are shapes that do not reference anything in the visual world. In the case of Mondrian, they reference geometric shapes rather than forms from real visual experience. Machine parts too do not reference nature, but are made up to serve another purpose. Here is a 3D form I generated using the Tinkercad software. It might sort of look like something, but it is in fact constructed of geometric solids. This sketch also helps us to see that there is a subset to non-representational forms, those that have volume. Unlike Mondrian, this form has the illusion of three-dimensionality. Architecture is one of the main ways in which this idea of non-representationalism has been expressed. This structure is filled with architectural devices that are used for load-bearing. There are also geometric embellishments used for decoration, but do not refer to forms found in nature. It is true that these decorative features may be based upon forms that have been abstracted from real forms in the distant past, forms such as trees, but at this point the building is not really showing that. They are more based upon the language of architecture and engineering necessity. Thomas Eakins painted this river scene with men in sculls, which are small rowing boats used for racing. The shape of the boats, however, serve as directional devices which point the eye diagonally across the surface of the painting. The bridge in the back, along with the bank of the river, all point our eye around like arrows, keeping us flowing through the scene. This is the intent of this bull-leaping fresco painted by the ancient Minoans. The shape of the bull has been elongated and pinched in the middle, exaggerating its forward movement and speeding up our eye. And of course, abstract work can also use shapes to move our eye around the composition. This one makes us meander and spiral around. Positive shapes situate themselves in the foreground. As in this medieval relief sculpture, we can see a clear delineation between the foreground figure holding the pail and the background. There is also a well and other figures which all constitute foreground shapes. Since the background is blank, it is easy to spot as the negative shape. In this painting, the surrealist René Magritte is visually confusing the notion of foreground and background. The woman, the horse, and the trees are all positive shapes, but their relationship to the background is intentionally confused to give a strange and slightly uncomfortable feeling to the piece. But what if the figure and ground are the same thing? In this common visual illusion, there are two figures wearing hats staring at each other. Or is it a single goblet in the center? It is in fact both. Whatever you focus your attention on becomes the foreground. The FedEx logo accomplishes the same thing. Have you ever noticed the white arrow? Designers sometimes use repeating shapes to harmonize their work. This quilt is a great example of this. It utilizes repeated hexagon shapes, both small and large, to unify all of the diverse colors and patterns it uses. Patterns are often used in architecture too, as in the Houses of Parliament in London. The long horizontal building repeats pillars and windows across the exterior. Shapes are frequently used to add beauty to a space. We call these decorative shapes. They are ornamental and are usually flat. Here is a part of an ancient Roman wall. It is filled with a mosaic that uses decorative shapes and patterns to fill an otherwise flat and boring surface. The artist Gustav Klimt is using decorative shapes to add life to the flat gold areas of his painting. Obviously, in order to make much from shapes, they need to overlap or penetrate each other. In this painting, the artist Vermeer shows us the front of a building, but the overall shape of the building contains many smaller rectangles that serve as windows. The windows in turn contain many smaller shapes that ornament the glass. Obviously, there are many other instances of shapes within shapes here. There seems to be a playful fascination with putting human forms within rectilinear shapes, for example. Many of these shapes have shapes beyond them, shapes that are spatially behind or deeper than the larger shape that contains them. But besides the normal experiences of shapes overlapping or containing other shapes that we can see around us, artists can use small shapes to construct larger ones. We saw this with mosaics, which are made of tesserae. But in painting and other art forms, artists can employ the same method. The artist Georges Seurat uses small dabs of paint to build his larger shapes. Before we can talk about mass, it is important to understand what is meant by volume. When any shape is projected into space, we say that it has volume. This can be actual volume or an implied volume. Implied volumes require lines, shading, color changes, or all three to give the appearance that a shape has dimension. Caravaggio uses all three of these in this painting. He uses color and value changes to make the figures appear rounded, and he uses values and lines to make the stone slab appear to jut out from the surface of his painting. Actual volumes, of course, are actual spaces. The Pantheon in Rome was one of the first buildings to take into consideration its interior volume. It was designed with the idea of a sphere to represent the heavens. The space is not solid or interrupted by walls or columns, but instead is vast and open. Again, this is a measurable distance that the building occupies in space. From the exterior, it is the same. The Pantheon takes up space. It is 276 feet in length, 190 feet wide, and 190 feet high. This is the volume of space it occupies. An object's mass deals with how much matter went into making it up. It has to do with how dense a material is and how much it weighs. Of course, this can all be implied. For example, the stone in the Caravaggio painting appears to have more mass than the figure standing on top of it. In fact, we might say that the stone is massive because it appears to weigh a lot and is large. It would be hard to move. The architects for the Pantheon were very aware of mass when they constructed it. The lower portion was made using concrete mixed with brick. This heavy material allowed it to support the dome. The dome itself, however, was made using concrete mixed with pumice. Pumice is less dense than the brick and therefore weighs significantly less. Because of this, the architects were able to make the dome reach 190 feet, the largest dome attempted for centuries. So, the mass of the dome was reduced at the top to keep gravity from pulling it down. Density has to do with the amount of matter occupied by a substance. Back to the idea of the materials used in the Pantheon. The brick in the lower portion contains more mass because the material is pressed closer together, and therefore it weighs more. The pumice stone is airy, that is, it is filled with holes that trap air. Therefore it is less pressed together than the brick, and therefore it weighs less.